for Dave Cushman's website because there is quite a lot of useful information on there. It's all sound, it's all sort of fairly relevant to practical beekeeping, most of it anyway. And there's of course a lot of information on there that will suit the newish beekeeper. So a bit about this webinar then. It's really aimed at new beekeepers, as the whole of this sort of stream is. So people who've only just started keeping bees, or perhaps the first year, or might be two at a stretch. What I'm doing is I'm only describing simple methods. When making increase, which this is obviously about, there's usually quite a lot of more complicated methods that are indicated or described. I haven't done that. I've basically kept it to three fairly simple methods. Mainly for beekeeper who only has one colony, hence the title. There's a lot more elsewhere for the more experienced beekeepers, and perhaps once you move on from this stage, there are going to be other webinars. There's an awful lot of stuff on Dave Cushman's website for increase. But when you think about increase, it's not just increase of bees. It's about queen rearing, which of course increase can help you do anyway. What I'm assuming is that you folk want to keep your increase in the same apiary. There are various tricks that are involved, but I've avoided all of those. And I've assumed that you haven't got an out apiary somewhere, because with only just one or two colonies, it's unlikely. What I'm hoping to do is to encourage you and help you to get two colonies strong enough to go into winter, because if they're not strong enough, they're likely to fall over, and that's not much good to anyone. I cannot teach everything there is for increase. So I'm just going to keep it to the absolute basics, just to help you people understand the sort of fundamentals, and then you can move on from there. Now, throughout, there will be some repetition, because what I find with beekeepers, especially newer beekeepers, I need to repeat things to keep reinforcing things. Because there's so much to take in, and if they hear the same thing two or three times, perhaps in a slightly different context, they will hopefully retain the knowledge. So why a second colony then? Well, colony losses these days are a lot higher than they used to be in the past. Many years, go back 30, 40 years, many years, winter losses were less than 5%. Now they can be very, very much higher. And in fact, this year I've suffered, well, I haven't, but my local association has suffered quite a bit because of high losses. So why is that then? Well, we got disease, Varroa mainly, and the viruses that vectors. Overall, beekeepers are a lot less experienced than they used to be. And of course, this people coming into beekeeping, of course, are inexperienced. So they're likely to make a few mistakes, or perhaps not notice things that more experienced beekeepers would. Starvation is a major problem. Starvation used to be just a winter problem. Now it's a summer problem as well. And mainly the reason, I think, is because of poorly adapted bees that people tend to use these days. Very much from imported stock that just simply falls over during the winter. They don't suit the climate. And then you can get other things like perhaps mice and woodpeckers, which are, I won't say extreme, but they are much rarer than the others. And there are several other things as well, too many to mention. What I know, having bees for 56 years is that a colony lost to me is very annoying. And if it's annoying for me, I guess it's pretty disappointing for any beginner as well. Especially if they find out at the end of the day that it is actually avoidable. So there are quite a lot of benefits from the second colony. I try to encourage people to get the second colony within reason as quick as they can. If they can do it the first year, so much the better. If not, certainly the second year. And with the high losses these days, I don't want to frighten you at all, but anybody who's got a bit of garden space, I'm suggesting that they have 3 colonies, because if you've got, even if you've got 2 colonies, you can very easily lose both of them. The reason why you have some more is because if something goes wrong with one, you've got another one to help it out. Colonies very often go queenless, and of course, if you haven't got a queen, another colony, you haven't got any queen or brood to help it out. Therefore, you've either got to go buying one or perhaps scrounging off local beekeepers, all sorts of things like that. And then, of course, there may well be management reasons as well. So perhaps one has come if you've got one colony that's a bit on the weak side. If you've got a second colony that's strong, you can help it out with perhaps a bit of food or a frame of food or frame of brood as well. Obviously, making up losses, which I should be mentioning quite a bit. What I'm hoping to do is to get you to acquire the replacement or produce a replacement without acquiring it somewhere, either being given or going out and buy, which I'm afraid is an issue with quite a lot of beekeeping associations. Oh, I've lost my colony. Oh, go and buy another one then, rather than teaching them how to produce a second colony from the first one. And the great thing about it is, if you do that, it's made within your own apiary. So that gives you personally a lot of benefits. Personally, I think it's much more interesting and satisfying than it is buying. If you've produced something, it's I think probably much better than if the courier brings it. So what else can I add to that then? Well, it doesn't actually take that much longer to look after 2 colonies than it does one, because of course a lot of the preparation time is the same. So the time it takes you to get your smoker lit and get kitted up if indeed you have, get down to the apiary, take all the bits and pieces that you want. It really doesn't take that much longer for the second colony. And the great thing about more bees is the more colonies you have, the more times you're going to get a head stuck into a beehive. Therefore, the more learning opportunities, and you can call that colony years if you like. But if you're able to take in what the bees are trying to tell you, interpret what they're trying to tell you, it's going to take you half as long to get to a position with 2 colonies than it will with one. It also helps you realise that bees do behave differently. Certainly, different colonies behave differently, which isn't realised by an awful lot of beekeepers, I'm afraid. I usually come out with a bit of friendly advice, bits and pieces here. If you are going into second colony, I suggest very strongly that you stick to one hive type, or certainly frame type. Perhaps if you've got national, just for argument's sake, if somebody gives you a WBC, it's the same frame size, different box size, don't turn it down. You can use it. On many occasions, I've had both kinds. Certainly, when in my early days, and if you see the next webinar at 7:30, you'll see some of the ramshackle hives that I've used in my time. I know of several beekeepers who've got a second hive that's different. Oh, we'll just try it and see what it's like. Sorry, but you just haven't got the experience and knowledge at an early stage to be able to decide which one's better or not. Controlling colony numbers, especially in the early stages, can be quite difficult for a few people. It's termed bee fever. So if you are looking at increasing, make sure you don't overstretch yourself. Try and stick it within keep it within the number of colonies that you're able to look after and care for properly. Otherwise, you'll have swarms coming out left, right, and centre, and it won't be you collecting them or removing them from somebody else's chimney. You'll leave that to somebody else, because that's what usually happens. I'm probably well known for advising certainly beekeepers to avoid buying bees or queens. They're very easy to produce. The bees will help you. They do most of the work if you organise it rightly. And the problem with some of the bought bees and queens is that they are imported, and as I'm sure you're aware, with recent publicity, that there are very great dangers of using imported bees and queens. Once you've got bees, you'll find there's absolutely no need to buy any more. And why some beekeepers do, I've no idea. But I've been the auctioneer at the West Sussex auction for now over 30 years. And right since we started in 1973, I've inspected the bees that have come in. And the last 30 years, I've sold them as well. And the people with 6, 8, 10 colonies, and they're buying bees. And I ask them why they're buying bees. And they say, oh, I lost 2 colonies or 3 colonies during the winter. Well, can't you make them up for yourself? Oh, I don't know how to. Nobody taught me. So, you know, they're quite on paper, experienced beekeepers don't know how to do the basics. Now, it's not often realised, but in my book, swarming and increase really do go together, because swarming, of course, is a bee's method of increase, and you know, the swarming process and that sort of thing is relevant to doing managed increase. There's quite a bit of information in the other presentation, the other webinars. So when they come, if they haven't already done so, get stuck into them as well. You might not understand everything. Don't worry too much about that. And don't try to learn more than you actually need. That might sound a daft thing to say, but there's no point getting your head just full of a load of stuff that certainly a beginner's point position you may not need. So what are the common mistakes? Quite a lot of them, and even experienced beekeepers make them. Sorry, but yes, we do. Bees to brood ratio very often is wrong. People are all keen to get a nuke made up, so make up a 5-frame nuke. Probably put all brood in there, mainly unsealed, and then they don't get the bees right. So the bees fly home and leave nothing to look after the brood. So you end up with chilled brood and subsequent problems. So that's one issue which I'm trying to overcome with the 3 methods that I'm going to explain to you. Too much unsealed brood is not quite the same thing, but it needs to be in balance. And by preference, I would much rather use sealed brood in increase than unsealed brood for reasons that I will explain later. Not strong enough to go into winter, usually because people take they got their first colony or two, they take the supers off in August, and then they try splitting the colonies. But of course, it takes a bit of time for the queens to get mated, and they're on a downhill slope, so they don't get the number of young bees that they need to go into winter, and they just simply aren't strong enough. And a lot of them just fall by the wayside back end of the year, November, December. Feeding too soon after making up is a common mistake as well, especially if it's within the same apiary, because, and I've seen this on several occasions, what happens is people are told you've got to feed a nuke, got to feed a nuke. You actually haven't got to feed a nuke if you make it up properly. And I've seen people make up a nuke, let's say midday, put a feeder on straight away. And of course, what happens is the bees in there get a belly full of food, go charging off home and telling their sisters or half sisters that, oi, there's a feeder full of food 20 yards away. Let's go and help ourselves. And that can happen quite a bit. And it doesn't matter how much you close an entrance down in a situation like that. So, of course, robbing is an issue as well, especially if you've got a nectar dearth. So be aware of what's happening. If you've got nectar coming in, you can get away with almost anything. If you've got a nectar dearth, which could be caused by poor weather or no flowers, as sometimes you get in June and getting into July. And of course, the bees haven't got anything. Also, if you get a heat wave as well, very often the plants don't secrete nectar, and so there's nothing for the bees. So go and try and find it somewhere else. I've seen ever so many cases where people have just put one or perhaps two frames of bees in a nuke, and then expect a small colony like that to draw out foundation, which is a big strain on them. You need to understand what's happening inside a colony so that you can help the bees by setting it up correctly. And a lot of people, I'm afraid, even people have been keeping bees 5-10 years, don't seem to understand what's happening in the colony. So try and learn that. Try and observe what the bees are doing, and see if you can use what they teach you to help them produce you extra colony. And of course, asking too many people, and that is a major problem in beekeeping, which I've covered in other webinars. It's no good asking more than one person because you'll get told different things. They might all work or they might not work. And then, of course, beekeepers get confused, try and mix things up, and you end up with a problem. Just ask one person, latch onto a really good beekeeper if you possibly can, and ask them. What I do know is that making increase is not difficult. It really isn't. If there are any problems, they can usually be avoided in some way. But I'm a great believer in if you make mistakes, they're probably the best way to learn, especially if they're your own mistakes and not somebody else's. It's strange that a lot of people think other people are daft for making exactly the same mistakes that they would make, but there it is. That's life. Some of them can be retrieved. It's difficult to give an answer now, but it may well be that perhaps just giving some extra bees or taking some brood away or something like that might retrieve a problem for you. What I do know is information, wherever you get it from, once you've gained it, it's always useful, even if you keep it in the back of your head and remember it in 2, 5 or 10 years time. I'm going to ask you, please don't take the easy route and go charging off and buying your second colony, because you won't learn anything, and it'll be more expensive, and it may well not be what you want. Much of what I'm going to tell you in this webinar should be taught in your first year. If it isn't, I won't criticize anybody. All I'll say is that if you haven't been taught it, then perhaps you better go back to your local beekeeping association and suggest that somebody looks at the this recording. I don't want to cause any problems in local beekeeping associations, but I think much of what I'm going to tell you should be taught within your first year. A lot has already been covered in the basics webinar, which I think was last week or the week before, can't remember now. Just go back, have a look at that, and see what you can glean from that. But whatever it is, you're going to learn something. Enjoy it, because beekeeping in my book is fun. So make an increase then. All beekeepers need to do it from time to time. So backing out and taking the easy route isn't really a long-term option, because we all do it and we're all learning. I'm even learning after over half a century's beekeeping. I'm still learning things all the time, and it's usually something I'll pick up from somebody else, or the bees teaching me, or something I think to myself, that's so simple, why haven't I thought of it before? In my view, it is good for early learning, and I'm going to be telling you a little bit about swarms in a little bit, and I think that's a good way of learning, or some things anyway. Great thing is you can see a colony develop. So perhaps if you make up four frame nuke in May, you'll see how it builds up, how it develops, and more importantly, you'll probably find that if you did exactly the same thing next year, it will be different. It might take longer or quicker, or the bees behave in a slightly different way, but they know what they're doing. We need to interpret that somehow. Now, there are going to be some variations on what I'm telling you here, and it could be on the timing, such as perhaps something you do in May, you may do it differently in July and August. It also depends on where you are, because if you're up in, let's say, Cumbria, you're going to be doing things at perhaps a different time than I will in West Sussex. The fundamentals of making increase, I think you need to know fairly early, and most of them I'm going to give you today. But however you get on in beekeeping, whether you stick to 1 or 2 colonies, or you get up to 20 or 30, or even 400 or 500, the principles are exactly the same for everyone. It's just the methods of achieving that may vary a bit. If you do anything in beekeeping, I think you've got to think success. Yes, it's going to work, rather than failure. Oh no, I think I've done wrong there. Think success if you can, because the bees are. So what do you need to know then? Well, a sound knowledge of the basics, which we've already been through, but I'll go through perhaps some slightly different ones a little bit later. If made up on site, flying bees will return home. So if you've got a colony in one place and you split it or whatever, and you move that somewhere else, 10 feet away or 10 yards or something, the bees will come back to the original place. That can be difficult to for a beginner to make up a nucleus. So there's three methods that I've got here rely on the increase part staying on the same stand as the parent colony. So that's should make it easy for you. Non-flying bees will struggle to defend themselves. This is exactly the same thing. I do see very often people make up a increase, leave it on the same site. All the flying bees go home and just leaves the young bees behind. And if they can't fly, they can't defend themselves. And of course, if you've got a nectar dearth, you end up with robbing, not just bees, but possibly wasps as well. And then you've got pandemonium setting in. Don't feed a colony or a nucleus immediately after making up, which I've already hinted why. Now, what a lot of beekeepers don't seem to realise is bees don't build foundation when there's nothing coming in, either from forage or from a feeder, because they do need food to produce the wax in order to produce a comb. And that's one of the reasons that I'll be explaining to you to try a method to try and get combs drawn outside the brood chamber. Sealed brood needs less bees to look after it, and I've got a whole slide on that later. But again, a lot of people don't seem to realise that if you've got unsealed brood, it needs feeding, it needs warmth, it needs looking after. Sealed brood doesn't need anywhere near so much, so it's not a burden on the colony. And here's another one that isn't taught very much. If you've got a frame of brood, when it emerges, you've got 3 frames of bees. So depending on how you make the increase up, if you make it up almost always sealed brood, it will build up an awful lot quicker than if it's unsealed. Yeah, it'll gain a couple of weeks or so. And of course, you need to recognize disease. But I'll be talking about that, and I'll keep talking about it. I'm not getting paranoid about it. Please don't think that at all. But if you just recognize what good healthy brood is like, anything wrong with it, and you ought to try and find out what it is. So here are the basics and relevant to this topic. You need to know the life cycle of queen, and to be able to detect or recognize diseases and pests. Know the swarming procedure. What happens in the colony when the queen is removed, and the principles of making increase, which I will try to cover at this sort of level. So I'll briefly cover them. Most of them are actually covered by other webinars, but of course they're all over the place. So of course some of them may well be after this one. So honeybee life cycles, I'll just confine it to the queen. You've probably seen this elsewhere. The real thing that's relevant is the fact that the queen cell is sealed for 7 days, and these two, whoops, let's go, yeah, laser pointer here. These two here, queen cell is sealed on the 8th day. I know some books are saying 9th day, but work on the 8th day, and she should emerge on the 15th day rather than the 16th that some books tell you, because the bees can pinch a day, not much more than that. They can go over the top by several days, but they can't seem to pinch much more. This table is on Dave Cushion's website. I won't bother with the worker and drone because they're fairly irrelevant to what we've got here. These are important, and if you've heard some of my lectures before, these are nice and easy to remember because the egg hatches into larva after 3 days. It's sealed on the eighth day. This is from the laying of the egg, and it emerges on the 15th day. And they're nice and easy to remember because you just take 3. That's all you've got to remember, and then multiply that. 3 3s are 8. 3 8s are 15. And also, you've probably heard before, that's wrong. Yes, it is. But if it helps you remember it, absolutely fine. Again, this one I keep showing, but I got to keep telling people to check for healthy brood because sooner or later something will happen and excuse me, something might happen and you end up with disease that you're not expecting. The main things we need to worry about are the 2 fowl broods, European and American. The first frame out of a colony, every time you look at it, check the sealed brood for signs of American fowl brood, unsealed brood at this stage where it's filling the cell up for European fowl brood. And I've got some other slides a bit later on which should show you them closer up. I do it at every inspection, and I suggest that everybody else does, and just make it a habit, exactly the same as it probably is looking at your record sheet or lighting your smoker. So here they are. Get into the habit of being able to recognize healthy brood, both sealed and unsealed. And if there looks anything wrong with it, check it out before making any increase or moving combs around from one colony to another. It's quite rare that you'll get brood like that, but that's a good one. See, everything's slightly domed, no sunken cappings, there's no discoloring, no holes in or anything like that. And this is healthy unsealed brood, and it's at this stage you need to look at it. And these are called by some people pearly white larvae, but they've all got their segments. They've retained their shape, and they've retained the colours, sort of glistening white. Anything different than that is likely to be a problem. Just find out what it is before spreading it between or expanding it by making more colonies. So in this stage, remember, white, bright, and curled up tight. If one of those is missing, check it out, see what it is. So the swarming process, when the first egg is laid in cups, I call that day 0. Others tend to get laid over several days. I've seen them down to 2 days, but usually it's 5, 6, perhaps 7 days, something like that. They're staggered. After the 3rd day, we reckon that the first one hatches into a larva, but it may not be because something else might have overtaken it. But normally 3 days. 8 to 9 days, first queen cell is sealed, and that's usually the trigger, assuming everything's in the right condition, the weather, the time of day, and that sort of thing. The bees will swarm with the old queen, leaving behind these the result of these eggs that were laid earlier. So after 15 or perhaps 16 days, the first virgin queen emerges, and one of 2 things will happen. Either she will run around and kill her sisters or half sisters, and maybe with the help of the workers, and she will take over the colony. Or she may just go out with another smaller swarm, which is called a cast. So that's important to learn because it is relevant to making increase. It really is simple. There's nothing magical about it at all. The bees know exactly what they're doing. You need to know what happens when a queen is removed from a colony, because I'll be encouraging you to split an existing colony, and you need to know what's going to happen in the half that hasn't got the queen. Of course, emergency cells will be built. That's assuming it's got young larvae. If it hasn't got young larvae, the chances are you wouldn't try to make increase from it anyway. These will be built on existing worker larvae because that's all they've got. And worker larva and queen, we think, are the same. They may not be. Somebody in future may decide that they've got differences, but at the moment we think they're the same. Bees prefer to build on new comb or the edge. So if you've got perhaps a few new combs in a colony and some older ones, the bees are likely to use the larvae that are on the new comb to make the to convert into queen cells. Now they can swarm, even though they're emergency cells. If the colony is strong enough and the weather is right, early enough in the season, all sorts of things like that. I've had colonies swarm on emergency cells on many occasions. Please don't take too much notice of people that say, oh, it doesn't happen. They only swarm on swarm cells, because they do. And if anyone tells you that you get poor queens from emergency cells, you can do, but so you can get poor queens from other queens produced from other queen cells. You can get some really good queens. So use them if you've got good cells. So this is what you'll see. That's probably 2 days after being started. So you need to look for something that looks a little bit like that. And then that one and that one are probably a day or so older than the other one. That one, yeah, difficult to say, can't see the size of the larva. These have probably been converted about 4 days. Something 4 days, something like that. Well, that's sorry, let's go back. These are built from the midrib of the comb. You can see, you're looking on the face of the comb, and you can see they're building them outwards. These two here, they're building on the edge of the comb, and you can see that they've come from the midrib rather than being built from cups. Both of those, by the way, they look really good to me. They're probably 2 days off emerging, 3 and an outside push. Both of those will probably make good queens. If you only want one of them and you're making up increase, and you've got a frame like that with a cell on, just pinch one of them out, decide which one you want, and move it with the comb. And all of what I'm doing here doesn't involve cutting out queen cells and place them in colonies. Everything is nice and simple. So the options for increase that we've got obviously swarms. They will of course be other people's, not yours, but that's a legitimate way, in my view, of making increase for a beginner. And make an increase on combs, existing combs from your first colony, which in fact is splitting it. And the other one, of course, is buying bees. Well, that's the easy way out. You could do well, or I have seen some awful bees being sold, including on several occasions some with foul brood. I would, once you got bees, I wouldn't even think about buying any more bees. So let's just look at swarms first then. They are frowned upon by some because they seem to think that all swarms are bad-tempered. Yes, they can be. but so can a nucleus that you buy from somebody else, especially somebody if it's who has milked the flying bees off. They'll be brilliant for a week, and then all of a sudden they could turn nasty. And of course, people dislike them because they always carry disease. They're the two things. They're always going to be diseased, or they're always going to be bad-tempered. Well, you can get over the disease issue, and I'll tell you how in probably the next slide. And if they're bad-tempered, I haven't got too much of a problem with that because it is teaching the new beekeeper something. And neither of them are a danger if you're careful. Personally, I think a swarm is a brilliant learning opportunity. And if a beginner has got the choice of a swarm or buying a nuke of really soft bees off the internet or local supplier or whatever, I would go for a swarm every time because you learn so much more. Thing is, often in a rush, because of course swarms don't hang around waiting for you to get home from work or to get your hive ready or anything like that. If you hear of it in the evening, perhaps after 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, something like that, you'll be okay to take it a little bit more leisurely. But if it's 11 o'clock in the morning, get there sharpish. You do need to prepare, get everything ready. Your new hive, get your frames made up, but don't put foundation in because you don't know when it's going to be used, and foundation can go stale quite quickly. So keep that in the packet, keep it sealed up, and it doesn't take you long to make up a few frames of foundation. Put a foundation in frames. You ought to get a brood box done in a half hour at least. Great thing is they're free. And if you collect a swarm, either yourself or with help from somebody else, all the time it's going into a beekeeper's hive, beekeeping has got control of it rather than it probably going in somebody's chimney or cavity wall or something like that and causing a problem. You'll probably need help collecting it, hiving it. Don't be frightened to ask for help. And if you go on the swarm list, I wouldn't suggest at your stage you go on the swarm list, or certainly not in the first year. Go on the swarm list, but go on the swarm receivers list if your local association's got one, so that if one of the swarm collectors got a swarm they don't want, your name's on the list. Then there isn't quite so much urgency, because if they've got it held captive, then it can be kept for a couple of hours or so. So how to hive a swarm? And there's lots of different ways advised. This is how I would do it if I didn't know the source of it. I would hive it on foundation, not drawn comb, but that's okay because beginners are likely to have foundation anyway. But if you, let's say, bought out another beekeeper or somebody let you have a hive with some old combs in, if the swarm has come from somewhere else, don't put it on combs, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Isolate it as well. Now, when I say isolate, if you've only got a small garden, 10 feet's better than right next door to your existing colony. 10 yards is better than 10 feet. And don't feed it for a week. Why am I suggesting all this? Well, because there's an absolute outside chance of that swarm coming from a colony that's infected with foul brood. And they may bring the infection with them in the honey they carry in their stomachs. Now, if you hive it on foundation, they're using that food to produce the wax, to produce the comb. Whereas if you had comb, you gave them comb, they'll store the honey in the comb, and then of course any infection would keep going. Isolate them, because if they have come from another a colony that's infected, they might not orientate too well straight away and perhaps go into your other hive. I've no real proof of that, but let's just cut down all the possibilities. And don't feed it for a week, because what we want to try and do is get the bees to use up the honey that's in there that they brought with them. So they cleared everything out. And I don't normally reckon to feed a swarm anyway, simply because in my experience, they manage themselves quite well. If there is a nectar dearth on, then obviously, yes, they do need feeding. But you can keep an eye on that. Just a couple of days after, or 2 or 3 days after you've hived it, have a look in the cells. If there's plenty of food and they're building comb and they're filling it, then you're okay. There's no real problem. Sometimes, in fact, quite often, you hive a swarm and it absconds. Quite common, could happen 50% of the time, quite easily. So we need to try and prevent that happening. Well, clipping your queen's wing is one of the easiest ways, because even if they come out, they're probably going to cluster on the front of the hive or perhaps underneath. It may well be beyond you at the stage you're at. Don't worry, ask somebody else. Tell them the situation and ask them. And quite frankly, if somebody's good enough to collect a swarm, they ought to be good enough to clip a queen. So perhaps the person that helped you should have done it for you. An alternative is to cage the queen for a couple of days, and then of course they can't go. They start building their nest, and it'll be easier for them to stay. But of course, brood has probably got more hold on them than stored nectar has, and of course, the queen hasn't laid yet, so they might still come out after that time. And another way, common way, is to put a queen excluder under the brood chamber, but don't do that for very long, probably no more than about 4 days, for a couple of reasons. One is that all swarms, well, most swarms take drones with them, and they'll need to be able to fly, and you don't want drones clogging up the queen excluder. That's one thing. The other thing is bees bring in pollen. You don't want the pollen scraped off the legs of the bees when they go to the queen excluder. So there's a couple of reasons. In beekeeping terms, if a queen excluder is put under a brood chamber to try and imprison a swarm or bees in a hive, it's called a queen includer, not excluder. Keep them in the shade. If you've got bright sunny weather, I was just looking at the window there, I don't know why. Bright sunny weather, if you've got the sun beating down on a hive, expect the swarm to abscond. They very often do. Now, with a swarm, you may end up with a very good queen, or you may need to requeen quite quickly. Don't worry about that, because don't forget you've got your other colony, which you can help with producing another queen. So that's just about it for hiving a swarm. Nice and easy. Information's on Cushman's website, almost the same as that. Now, you could end up like this situation, which was actually quite a difficult swarm to take, because around the post there, a chicken wire netting, and the swarm got held up in there. And that actually did take quite a time to get out. And Sigri, the girl, she was only a beginner, although her mother kept bees, or her father kept bees for 40 years before that. This was her first colony. She'd never been involved with the bees at all, and she wanted to take up bees. And she heard of a swarm and asked if I'd help her. And there she is, beginner, look, bare arms, she sought help, and she, I think, will learn an awful lot. If you are perhaps a teacher listening in tonight, or you're watching the recording, let the beginner do as much as they possibly can, because they're not going to learn too much by you doing it. There's the bees there, and it looks easy, but they're actually quite difficult. They just would not go up into that skip. They could be anywhere. This is on a fence post, and they just would not go up into the skip, and they had to get brushed off in the end. So take them home. I won't worry too much about the finer details here. Put them on a sloping board up to the hive. Normally I'd put a cloth on to stop them going underneath, but that was quite a small swarm, so I didn't bother. And if you've got the board sloping uphill, they just go in themselves. So that's nice and easy to do. Nice, easy way of getting an extra colony, and you haven't got to deplenish your own. So that's about the swarm. Now make an increase from your existing colony, and here's the principles I was telling you about. From existing colony, the increase itself needs to be viable. Now that may well depend on the time of the year, because you can get away with making up just a 2-frame nuke early in the year, and if you haven't seen it, we've got a video on that. Sorry, a webinar on that, and it's also on Cushman's website as well. But you can't make one of those up in, let's say, August and expect it to get to the winter, because you've lost 3 or 4 months of it building up. So it needs to be viable. Whenever you're making up, try to make sure that your frames are well covered with bees, so it is densely populated, because if it isn't, the brood won't get fed properly, and then of course you end up with nutrition problems and possible robbing because they can't defend, all sorts of things like that. And it needs to have food as well. And I will show you some typical combs that you can make an increase up with. You then, of course, need to provide it with a queen or queen cell, and I've got some ideas for you later on. So what do you actually need then? Well, equipment-wise, no specialist equipment at all. A nucleus box is usually handy. If you've got one, you may choose to use it. It's not essential, but I think nuke boxes are pretty useful bits of kit. You clearly need spare hive parts, whatever you do. And of course you need frames, which could be perhaps frames already made up, and you put foundation in later, or drawn combs, which I'll explain to you a way of producing those a little bit later. What else do you need? Well, you clearly need bees. Well, if you take frames out with covering bees, then you've obviously got them. Make sure you've got some reasonable brood and food, and a queen or means of making one. Now we're doubling up here, so we'll be taking bees and brood and food away from colony, but we're only going to end up with one queen. So we need to make a queen somehow. And then, of course, we need room for it to expand, especially early in the season, because depending on how you make it up, it can expand quite rapidly. And if you haven't looked at my webinar on a 2-frame nuke, have a look at that, because it usually expands in bursts. You also need lateral thinking as well, which might be a little bit difficult for a beginner, because of course they haven't had the experience. But try to work out, let's say if you've got a frame of sealed brood, just for argument's sake, worker brood is sealed for 12 days. You've got to think that within 12 days, that one frame of sealed brood is going to produce you roughly 3 frames of bees. So you need to provide room, and also if the weather's bad, it will probably need feeding as well. So there's all sorts of things like that. The more experienced beekeeper will know, but as a beginner, you've probably got to work it out yourself. In my opinion, combs are much better in the brood chamber than foundation. But of course, as a beginner, you may not have it if comb. So if foundation is all you have, then use it. If the weather's poor, you may have to feed, but we'll talk about that a little bit later, or even ask questions if you wish. Why comb? Well, bees will only draw out foundation if they've got income with which to produce the wax to build the comb. Now that will come from either forage or feeding. I'm sorry, folks, but I dislike feeding in the summer unless it's an out-and-out emergency. So I prefer them to use a forage. If there's no income and you put foundation in the brood box, the bees climb all over it. So you get a week's bad weather, and it goes all shiny, and it tends to lose the impression of the walls of the cells, the start of the walls of the cells. Sometimes it can go almost flat. And you get another week's bad weather, and the bees chew holes in it. Out comes the sun, and they build all over the place. So the income, when the nectar's turned on again, they tend to build very poor combs. So that's one of the reasons that I like to get my combs drawn outside the brood chamber. Now, of course, if you've got comb, even if the weather's bad, a queen hasn't got to wait for the worker bees to produce a comb for her. It's already there. They just clean it up, perhaps, and then she can lay in it within a day or so. Therefore, you get much quicker build-up, which is handy more towards the end of the year. Perhaps early in the season doesn't matter too much. But of course, a beginner doesn't have comb. So we can overcome it. So how are we going to do it then? The usual advice to beginners, and I expect it's happened to all of you, is that once you've got your bees in your brood chamber, put a super on. How many of you have been told to put a brood chamber instead? It's always a super, isn't it? Add a super. Why is that? Well, it's because that's what the book says. All the books say put a super on for the first one. Or, well, that's what I was taught, or that's all I know. Well, if that's all somebody knows, that's all they can teach you, isn't it? But there is another way. If you add a brood box of foundation as a super for your first super, when your first colony is strong enough, you then produce the brood comb for your second colony, so that you're not putting foundation in the brood nest. And if you play your cards right, you'll also have honey as well. Okay, you might not have a honey extractor, you might not have one anyway, but surely one of your local beekeepers has got a honey extractor that would take brood combs. Most of them seem to. So you've got a little bit of honey and you've got some decent combs. So there we are. Don't bother with the super. Put the queen excluder. See the colour of my queen excluders? There is a brood chamber full of foundation, and lid back on. Just let them build it out. You then should, fingers crossed, end up with combs like that, which you can then either extract or use as food for your new colony. Why not? If you're not particularly fussed about honey, then you can use it for food for the new colony. Now, in a single brood box, what happens is the queen is confined by the floor at the bottom and either a crown board or a queen excluder at the top. Therefore, when she's laying, she tends to go across the box, and that colour there throughout is going to be brood combs looking on the end. Sorry, they're a bit up and down, but that's how thorns make them. Now, if you've got a double brood box, and I'm not advocating double brood boxes, I never do, and you need to be aware that most people who use double brood boxes have got prolific bees, but that's beyond today's webinar. Naturally, bees build vertically because that's what they do in a cavity in a tree. So if you put another brood box on the top, the bees will build straight up through the middle. It's called chimneying. Now, we can take this knowledge and this behavior and we can use it to our advantage. So here's option one for making increase. Let the colony build up so it's to the position where you would, probably got 6-8 combs of brooding. Then add a brood box. If you've got comb, use it. If you haven't, use foundation. Now the foundation is going to be above the brood. There are a lot more feet climbing all over this area than there is this area. So even if you put that box of foundation on and you've got a week's bad weather, there's not too much damage to be done. Out comes the sun and the bees will start working on this probably quite quickly. They'll probably go up through the middle first. Again, they will chimney. Now, I don't know. Yeah. So they're building out the foundation and using it as they go. Now, if you've got comb, what you could have done, I haven't got this graphically, but what you could have done is taken 2 or perhaps 3 of these combs of brood, put them in the middle there, so you actually help the bees. I wouldn't do that with foundation, because if you do that with foundation, you've got to put some of the foundation down into the bottom brood box, which might make it go a bit stale. So let the bees build up naturally if you've got foundation. If not, if you've got comb, then you can put the brood in the top. Now, when it's strong enough, you decide that. I don't know, if you've got bees on perhaps 10 combs, brood on 10 combs, that'll be strong enough to split it, especially early in the season. You can then make your increase. So what we're going to do, one of those boxes, and it really doesn't matter which one, we just shunt it to the side, because what we're doing is splitting the boxes up. That's what we're doing. And then if we take the bottom one, we just drop the top one down, or the other way. It really doesn't matter. If you want to try and equalize them out a bit, perhaps you can take a frame or two of brood from one box and put in the other. But really, at this stage, it doesn't matter. As long as you've got on this stand 2 or 3 frames of brood, you should be okay. So we shunt it to one side, and this is the parent stand. This is a new stand. I'm suggesting that you leave the queen in the new stand. I hope I can tell you why in a minute. In the colony on the parent stand, we haven't got a queen. So we either give it a queen cell if we've got one, which could be if perhaps the colony is preparing to swarm itself. That would be ideal. If not, then we make sure there's some young brood, certainly eggs and young larvae in here from the that they can turn into a queen. I'll explain that a little bit later. The great thing about these webinars being recorded is you can stop them and you can move on or whatever, and you can you can hopefully gain much more for it. Now, the bees are going to fly out from that colony and they're going to return to that one. Okay, so this will lose some of the bees. In my experience, it's never really enough to cause much of a problem. But more importantly, it is going to bolster this colony quite a bit, which is much better for raising queens or raising queen cells than this colony that might be just a little bit short. So that's why I say in this and the next option is to leave the queen in the on the new site. Right, so that's option 1. If afterwards you want me to go back through it, then please tell Richard on the Q&A, and I'll go back. Now, option 2 is simple splitting. So what we do is we move the colony to one side. It really doesn't matter. Could be 3 feet, could be 30 feet. It doesn't matter at all. So like that. We then replace it with an empty hive. And then we take, if it's early in the season, take a frame of food and perhaps 2 to 3 combs of brood. You could take less, but from a beginner's point of view, it's probably nicer to be, or better to be, a little bit stronger. If it was later in the year, and it's difficult to give timings here because I don't know where you folk are in the country. But certainly for me in West Sussex, if I was getting into July, I'd say 3 or 4 combs of brood plus food. Now, the seasons do vary quite a bit, and so do locations as well. And I know some of you are probably in a marginal area for bees where they probably won't build up as quick as in the areas where there's much more forage. So that's it. Simple, nice and easy. I hope I haven't left anything out. But for those 2 options, we need queens for those on the parent stand. Please, please, please don't buy. There's no need to, and you do run the risk of getting something which may have a problem. I'm not saying it's going to, but it may have a problem. They're nice and easy to produce. You've got should have a queen in the moved colony, or the ones on the new site then. So they shouldn't be any problem at all. Bees will be added to the parent site, as I explained. Certainly if the weather's good. If the weather is a bit cool, what I find, or what I think, is that not all bees fly every day. So if it's really good warm day, I think you'll find most of those that are going to forage would have done so within a couple of 3 hours. But if it's fairly cool, you may find that some of them perhaps don't fly for 2 or 3 days. Now, if your colony is with either of those options, if it's preparing to swarm, just use the queen cells. I can't tell you what to do, because there are going to be several different options depending on the age of them. If not preparing to swarm, emergency cells will be built always. Now they can be started very quickly, or sometimes they can not start them for 3 or 4 days. So I would check after 3 days, because in most circumstances you will see emergency cells started. That's all right. Just make sure that everything's as it should be. There is an out-and-out possibility that there were 2 queens in a colony. I say out and out, but you know, very often there's two queens in a colony during the summer these days. At this stage, don't cut out any queen cells. This is important, because if you cut queen cells out at this point, the bees will build more, and they'll probably build them on larvae that are too old. If they're old, they're not getting the amount of food that they should do, and you could end up with poorer queens. So don't cut them out. I know what some of the books say, but don't cut them out at this stage. After about 9 days, don't go to 10, because you could have an emerging queen. About 8 to 9 days, reduce to 1 good queen cell. Don't leave 2, because you know what's going to happen, or is likely to happen. The colony may swarm, even though it might be fairly small. What you may find is that if the weather's good, out they go. And even if they're not filling the box up, they can still go. Now, the reason I say leave it 9 days is because, in general, it takes at least 7 days, or after 7 days rather, the bees can't convert worker larvae into queens, but very often they can hold back literally a handful of worker larvae, and they can produce queen cells after that. So if you reduce, let's say after 7 days, you've still got probably about 3 days. What can happen is if they can find a larva from somewhere else, they'll build another queen cell, possibly swarm on this one that you've got, and just leave a really, really poor queen behind. And you can then close it up, and I would check sooner, but for a beginner, I would check after 3 weeks, and you should find a laying queen there. When I say densely populated combs, that's what I mean. I don't mean that you can see all the brood, because that isn't going to do you or the bees any good at all. That is a good frame of sealed brood. You may have more brood, but that's pretty good. Once that's emerged, you've probably got 2.5 frames of bees. You've got food in there as well. that's a really good frame. If you can make up a nucleus with perhaps 2 like that, sandwich between is some brood in all stages, then within 5 or 6 weeks, that is going to be quite a quite strong colony. So why use sealed brood? And I promise you I'll get back to it. Well, it generates its own warmth. It needs less bees to look after it, where unsealed brood needs warmth, and it does need feeding as well. When it emerges, there is laying room for the queen, and by then she should perhaps be back and ready to start laying. And of course, you get quicker build up, which I explained earlier. Now, I'll repeat that a frame of brood becomes 3 frames of bees when it emerges. And you need to get this into your head very early in beekeeping, because it can really throw you. Because if you've got, let's say, 3 frames of sealed brood, you might go into a colony one weekend and think, oh, they're all right. You go there next weekend and they're absolutely bursting. Here's a good food frame. If you've got something like that, you'll be okay. And anything you make up, 4, 5, 6 frames, that will last them probably a couple of weeks. Now, option 3 is the artificial swarm, which I won't spend too much time on because it's in all the books, and most people seem to get taught it anyway. So if you've got queen cells being built, now you can do the same manipulation even if you haven't got queen cells, because you can bring them in from outside, and I've done it on many occasions. I've never actually made an artificial swarm myself for the purposes of swarming, but this is not swarming. It's really not swarm control. It's really increased. So if you've got queen cells being built, you haven't got to worry about a queen because they're already there. Now, if you want honey, you can have some as well with your supers. Now, there are several versions of the artificial swarm, and some of them have got sort of gentle tweaks. So just pick on one and use that. Don't try and take bits from each one unless you fully understand what they're trying to achieve. So you just move it to one side, replace it with an empty hive. Most people put in 1 frame of brood, preferably sealed. You can go more if you like, because we're not worried too much about honey. We're worried a bit more about the a better increase. Fill it up with comb or foundation. Now, when I've helped people, what I've found is if we fill up with comb, they don't often swarm afterwards. If you fill it up with foundation, they very often do. So that will need checking fairly regularly. It's normal to put the queen from the parent stock in this one, but you can, if you wish, leave it in the main colony. I really don't think it matters too much. And then, of course, you've got all these queen cells in here. You need to deal with them in some way. I don't know what the situation they're going to be in, and neither do you. But you will have to look in your books and find out what to do. But if it was me, I'll cut out all the sealed and the older sealed ones to reduce the chances of swarming. Don't forget, those queen cells can vary in age over probably anything between 2 and 6 or 7 days. So that's the artificial swarm. Go and have a look in your books and find out what you can from them, and you may even find something online on that. Make sure it's from a good source, though, not some you just started up beekeeping. Few tips. I have mentioned robbing. You may need to close the entrances down, especially if you've got a nectar dearth. Now, when does a beginner know if there's nectar dearth or not? Well, you can tell by the way the bees are flying, but you need to have seen them quite a lot of times. Have a look in the brood chamber, and if you've got unsealed nectar in the brood chamber, in general, you've got nectar coming in. If there's none in the brood chamber, then you probably haven't. Make sure they're densely populated going into winter. As I mentioned earlier, one of the major reasons that they increase fails is because people don't make them strong enough going into winter. 5 combs, well covered with bees, is likely to get through most winters if everything else is right. You can feed small colonies if you wish. It should get the queens in lay, but feed them fairly gently. Don't feed them too quickly, otherwise what you'll probably do is crowd the queen out. If you feed them gently, that should stimulate her to lay more eggs, so producing young bees, so build the colony up. What you can do, if you like, is certainly if you get into perhaps back end of July, August, is if one of your 2 colonies you think not very strong, go to the other one. Find a frame of sealed brood, largely sealed brood, shake the bees off and put it in the smaller colony. And if you do that, the same thing, another 7 to 10 days later, you'll be amazed at how you can build the little colony up. Obviously, shake the bees off. Don't forget to check for foul brood, always. And enjoy the learning, folks, because beekeeping is fun. Thank you very much indeed.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Roger.
How do you know it's excellent?
Well, I thought
you're guessing again, aren't you?
Guessing. I thought it was excellent. So keep your questions coming in, but we'll go for the ones that we've got. Probably best to get this one in first. Can you go over option 2 for splitting the hive again?
Yep. I've got to share again, haven't
I? Before we start getting into the other question.
Yeah. Okay. All right, here we go. Option 2. Option 2. Here we go. What have we got? Wrong one. Option 2, simple splitting. Yeah. So you've got your colony that may or may not have supers on, or a super, right? So what you're doing is you're going to shunt it to one side, like so. Replace it with an empty hive. It could be a nuke box, doesn't matter. But probably most beginners will not have a nuke box, but they might have a spare. Well, they've got to have a spare hive if they want to make increase. Right. So then basically what you're doing is just taking some of the frames and the adhering bees. I probably didn't mention that. And the adhering bees out of there, and you're putting them into the other colony. Now, for a beginner, up until, well, certainly June, end of June, in my area, West Sussex, I would say 2 to 3 combs of brood, plus a comb of food, like I showed you early in the season, and then fill up with comb or foundation if that's all you've got. Later in the season, give it an extra a comb of brood. Right. Now, locations, seriously, they do vary quite a bit. And some places, 10 or 20 miles apart, can be very, very different conditions, very different. Right, so that's it. Do they want me to go through again or not, Richard?
No, I think that's it. Well, unless anybody else comes back and says they still don't understand. So we'll move on with another question.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you don't have to do it quite like this, because you can leave that hive there, put the box alongside, just transfer them in, and then shunt it along, and then replace that one. You know. Okay, what else have we got? I'm coming out of this.
Okay.
I'll come back if that's what they want. I ain't got a problem. Yep.
Just Heather wants to know on that option 2, where's the queen in that one?
In both of them, they're on the new site.
On the new site, yeah.
Yeah.
So, next question. What do you mean by feed gently? Cliff wants to know.
Right. Don't get one of these big feeders and the overall feeder, and then just fill up with sort of a couple of gallons of syrup or whatever. It's not so easy these days as it used to be, because there used to be smaller feeders that were available. But I would probably aim for approximately, let's say, a pint a day, something like that. So these, I've got one here. You know, these little 4-point feeders are round plastic ones. I like them. I think they're good. Also, so are the plastic tray ones with the lid. I find them good as well. I would half feed or half fill one of the 4-point round feeders every other day. So they're not just piling it in. Because if they pile it in, they've, well, there's several things happening, by the way. If they pile it in, they can crowd the queen out, and we don't want to do that, because we want to encourage the queen to lay the amount that she would naturally lay, not over expansion, but what the bees feel that they can cover. If you close them off, you know, crowd them out, she can't get that extra that extra brood going. The other thing is, and this is something else that a lot of beekeepers don't realise, is that if you feed too heavily in one go, the bees just put the food straight into the combs, and then they've got nothing to produce the wax to seal it with. Whereas if you keep feeding gently, little and often, the bees put it in the combs, they ripen it, and there's more coming in to produce the wax to seal that last lot. So it cuts down fermentation as well. Also, and there's another great benefit feeding slowly, is that when you're feeding, forage bees seem to get diverted to go and produce pollen. They then put that in the cells. The bees then put your syrup or whatever feed you've got over the top of it, seal it, and they've got pollen for the winter. Whereas if you just feed down, especially if the weather's bad and they can't get out and get pollen, all they got is just a wall of carbohydrate. There's no protein there at all. So they got nothing for the winter. And this is where amateur beekeepers can probably put bees into winter in better condition than commercial beekeepers can. Commercial beekeepers, of course, they just got to feed down, and that's it. You know, they haven't got time to do it like amateurs will.
Okay. Next one is
no, we won't have that one. No, bypass that one.
Listen very carefully. I shall say this in advance. Jim says, I have one hive which I double brooded in the autumn with the original queen, as both my splits last year failed. Can I split them just by separating the brood boxes as you described? And how soon can I do that?
Yeah. He's. Did he say where he's from?
He doesn't.
No. Okay. Let's just assume it's Middle England somewhere. Then not up in up in the hill.
Devon.
Oh, Devon. Where's that? That's not even in England, is it? Well, one thing he's got to watch out for is 2 brood chambers. If the bees are all in the top one, or the brood's all in the top one, he's probably going to have to do a bit of juggling with his frames. But apart from that, he ought to be able to do what did I do? Option 1, wasn't it? No, option 1, I think. Yeah, option 1. I'd let the bees build up a bit first. And depending on how strong they are, if he took off a smaller nucleus earlier, a smaller one earlier, he could probably still get quite a lot of honey off the other one.
Let's have a look. Going back onto feeding, when to make this gentle feed, is it half strength syrup?
No, I never ever use half strength syrup. £2 a pint or 4 kilos of sugar to 2.5 litres of water, which is the same thing. Yeah, I can't see the point of having half strength. Never used it.
A fellow with a fantastic name, and it's not me, Richard, wants to know, would you treat a swarm for Varroa?
No. We're told that 80% of Varroa in a colony is in the brood, so they would have left it behind. But I said no. If you want to, there's no reason why you shouldn't, because you've got no brood to worry about. And I suppose something like thymal base, you could probably do it within 5 days, 5-6 days. How old are the larvae when the Varroa go in the cells? 8 days old, is it?
Around that, yeah, I think.
Right. Okay. With a swarm, very often, if you've got fertile queen, very often you hive it at night, and you've got eggs in cells the following morning. So I would probably take the hang on, wait a minute, thymal. Put the queen off lay, wouldn't it? Oxalic acid might be a better option. Perhaps spraying, but I've never done it, so you need advice from somebody else locally. Yeah.
6 days Varroa into the cell.
Right. Okay. But yeah, it's gonna put the queen off lay anyway. So we won't go down that route.
Yeah. Could you do an oxalic trickle?
Yeah. I think.
Yeah.
Or a little bit of spray, I would think. Yeah, I think. Oxalic trickle. Don't forget, you've got bees at broken cluster. So I don't think it will be that effective. I think probably spraying them might be the better way.
Yeah. Okay. Fiona says that she struggles to find her black queen. She's not marked. In fact, she's never seen her. Any tips on making sure that she's gone with the old box when splitting? So when she's going through your options where the queen's got to stay with the box that's been moved,
Yep.
have you got any tips for making sure that the queen is in that box?
Okay. Well, obviously have a look. Don't give up. Because that is one of the reasons that people can't find queens, is because they think, oh, I can't find a queen, and they're sort of broken before they started. Make them up, make the 2 boxes up, leave them for an hour, and an hour later the bees should tell you which one's queenless. Then just swap the boxes over if the queen is on the parent's side. They should get over it, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
They would know that the queen is in the wrong one because of the sound that the bees were making, and
that's right. Yeah. Well, they stick the bums up in the air and within National glands protruding.
They could also shake all the bees down into the bottom box, put a queen excluder on, and if there's some open brood in that top one,
yeah,
it might equalize.
Yeah, I'm assuming most of these people are beginners, Richard.
Okay.
Let's make it easy for
them. To use brood chambers as supers of deep nationals, can I use deep national brood chambers as supers, or do I have to use the standard national brood chamber?
Well, anyway.
So she's talking about your method for producing drawn combs.
Yeah,
I think, and she says she's got deep nationals.
Well, deep national was actually 14 by 12.
14 by 12. So in which case she would just use 14 by 12 on top.
Yeah.
Shouldn't need to get a national.
There aren't many extractors that take a 14 by 12. So that's okay. All you do is just use those as food frames for the bees.
Yeah. Okay. And the second question there, to use a brood chamber as a super, do I need to use foundation, or can I let the bees build the comb naturally?
Oh yeah, you can let them build it naturally. In fact, if that was the case, I'd be quite happy to put them down in the brood chamber. Right. Yeah, there wouldn't be a problem.
So if you
haven't got the foundation. If you do that, make sure you put it down between 2 good combs. Otherwise, if you've got wiggly or lumps on them or whatever, the bees do all sorts of things. They build crossways and all sorts of things like that. Make sure you've got two good faces of a brood either side. Yeah. Something else, but you need to know that anyway. If you do that, make sure that the hive is level side to side. Otherwise, if it's tipped up, the bees always build the combs vertically. If it's tipped too much, then you'll have a problem.
Yeah. Can you take the queen from the swarm with a few nurse bees and then vapor with oxalic acid, and then return the queen after? To my knowledge, vaporizing oxalic acid doesn't affect the queen in the same way that a thymol-based treatment will.
I don't know. I never do it. I won't have anything to do with mentioning vaporizing, in the teaching situation, because I think it's so dangerous.
It's very dangerous.
Well, yeah, but if I tell somebody to do something and they misinterpret it or whatever, and there's a problem, I'm liable. Well, I think I am, and I'm not risking that.
I think regardless of the Varroa treatment that you use, you should always read the instructions carefully and follow those carefully. And that just about wraps it up.
Oh,
We've
right,
got,
okay.
we've got one question from Matt, who's not in the UK, which I'll post to you, but I'm not quite sure how much help it will be for others. Is there any downsides to having your second colony as a different type of bee, such as Ligustica? I am not in the UK, so the Italian bees are adapted to our area and available locally. So
It depends what his first colony is. The problem with these different, or one of the problems with different types of bees is that they're behaviorally, sometimes they're different. And if he's got his first colony, let's say Apis mellifera mellifera, they will have a much smaller brood nest than his Ligustica will. So there's really you've got to manage them in different ways. You'll certainly need a bigger brood chamber. They'll eat an awful lot more food as well. Now, it depends where he is. I mean, places like Switzerland, they've got all sorts of bees there.
Yeah. I suppose with having the same type of hive, having the same type of bees is useful as well, because you can make comparisons. You can manage them more efficiently, can't you?
Yeah.
And that brings us to the end of the questions.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much.
Our next webinar is at 7:30 this evening. And where are bees kept is what you're going to be answering at 7:30.
It'd be a little bit more light-hearted than this one.
So thank you very much, Roger. Thank you to everybody for attending.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and thanks Richard for hosting this, and we'll hopefully see you all at 7:30.
You will.
Okay.